Recording. Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ben. I'm the National Communications Coordinator at the Canadian Community Economic Development Network. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a settler on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, and Petun First Nations. I'm doing this land acknowledgement as an action against the erasure, violence, and genocide that colonialism continues to enact against Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and to acknowledge that I am complicit and a beneficiary of this violence, as ideologically opposed as I may be to it. Land acknowledgements can be stiff and rigid and formalistic, and I'm hoping that today's acknowledgement can be an action to invoke and provoke reflection, especially for the settlers amongst the participants like myself, to think about what it means to do right relationship with land and water and air and Indigenous peoples, and how we can move our definition of economy from something that's imposed on us through colonial systems towards something that is more holistic and aligned with many Indigenous worldviews of the care and keeping of our common home, and how we can do that through principles of community and collectivism and justice. It always feels a little mundane to move from big questions like that to housekeeping, but I will tell you that you are all muted on Zoom. So the way we will handle questions today is if you can enter any questions you have, whether technical or about the actual presentation, into the chat box, which you will be able to see by clicking chat on your Zoom screen. And either myself or Kirsten, who's Marguerite's colleague, will answer the question either directly or pose it to Marguerite during her Q&A periods. Questions that we don't get to, you can either email Marguerite directly, or you can wait for us to post the FAQ page that we will be posting to our website. We'll be collating and sort of synthesizing a lot of the questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer your question in that way. But Marguerite will also provide a bunch of other ways to sort of engage in the Common Approach community, which we hope you'll take her up on. The recording of this webinar will be posted to CCEDNet's YouTube page, and also placed on our site under the Common Approach Common Foundations page on that site. Give me a few days to do that. Hopefully within the week it'll be up. If you're having technical issues, if you're having trouble hearing or anything like that, one good idea is always to see if you can find an Ethernet cable and plug in directly to an internet source. If that doesn't work for you, try dialing in via phone line. There should be call-in information in the invitation that you received. Otherwise, you can chat me in the chat box and I can help you do that. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Margerit Roger.
Hello there. Welcome to the webinar that we're going to do today. I'm actually going to, now that I've said hello, I'm going to stop my video so that I can just have the screen up here, and I'll pop in again at the very end. All right. So welcome also to the Common Foundations, which is really the main part of what we're going to talk about. And as the name suggests, it's about shared foundational practices of impact measurement. I'm Margerit Roger of Eupraxia Training, and I'm a program planner and evaluator here in Winnipeg. And I'm working with Common Approach team and the Canadian CED network out of Ottawa to identify evaluators and consultants and trainers across the country who are working in the area of impact measurement. And those two organizations are collaborating to get the word out there about the Common Approach and the Common Foundations. And Kirsten Earl-McCorser of KEM Consulting is my colleague on this project. However, I know that there's a lot of other people on the webinar today, not just evaluators and consultants and trainers. There was a really huge interest, which is wonderful. Thank you all very much for joining us. I've been working in social impact analysis for about 7 years now, and I was really intrigued when I first found out about the project. There's been a lot of really important work done in impact measurement and social value measurement in Canada and in the US and around the world, especially in the last couple of years. But I feel like this project is what we need to make impact measurement much more accessible in the social purpose sector in Canada. somehow by distilling this impact measurement down to some fundamental and shared components, I think we get a framework and a starting point that we can grow and develop in many different ways into the future. To give you an overview now of what I'm going to cover in the webinar, and some of it I'll just be able to skim the surface of, but I've got some good resources listed at the end that you can learn more. First, I'll give you background and insight into why CCEDNet is engaged in this outreach, and also how the common foundations were developed and how they fit into the larger common approach to impact measurement framework itself. Then we'll go through the 5 common foundations, and there's actually 5 connected practices and an overarching principle that pulls everything together. So we'll talk about that. We'll give you some ideas about how the common foundations can be used and how they can benefit your work and the work of social purpose organizations in Canada. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Common Foundations Champions Initiative and the 2 LinkedIn groups actually, but one of them is specifically for the Common Foundations, so that we can hopefully bring people together and share information and bounce ideas off each other. And in the really short time since we launched this initiative, we've already been approached by quite a large number of practitioners who are interested in finding out more. And we've had people sign up for the LinkedIn groups. So it's very exciting. It's great. And there's a fair bit of content in the webinar, but we'll leave some time for questions. Both Kirsten and Ben from CCEDNet are going to keep an eye on the questions coming in, and we'll stop partway through and hopefully have some additional time at the end to answer remaining questions too. So the Common Approach and the CED network, they're collaborating on this for a number of different reasons. And the first bullet there, the community ownership is one of the fundamental principles of the Common Approach. And it's been a cornerstone of every aspect of this project. It's really important to both CCEDNet and the Common Approach team to reach out to the people that are working in social enterprises and social purpose organizations and academic institutions. And they were reaching out to funders and to people developing data platforms, and now specifically to evaluators and consultants and trainers. Because they really want to get a real sense of what impact measurement looks like in practice and what is needed to develop it and scale it up. And so they're reaching out to everybody on this call because in earlier stages of the project, the social purpose organizations said that they were looking for help in planning and carrying out more impact measurement. And you've probably heard this, or maybe if you're a social purpose organization, you're experiencing that. And CCEDNet is, of course, the umbrella for many of these organizations. So it's been a part of these conversations over the last few years about how to measure impact a little bit better. Really often sort of the basic output gathering is all that an organization really has time or expertise for. And so this bigger impact story is going untold, right? And evaluation can become a bit stressful then, because funding often depends on describing impact. So organizations really need more than outputs, but they're not necessarily sure where to begin. And so CCEDNet wants to support that work through the Common Approach and the Common Foundations collaboration, which is great. And of course, if impact-oriented evaluators are able to connect and to then be connected to the social purpose sector, it's far more likely that the larger impact story is being communicated well. There's basically an opportunity to have a collaborative effort that moves impact measurement to the next level in Canada. And that, of course, can begin to influence larger policy discussions, which CCEDNet is involved in. And also in other places. I was recently at a Latin American impact investing conference, and it was really clear that everybody that's working in this sector is challenged by the impact measurement piece and trying to find better ways to make decisions and to improve programs and communicate results and affect policy. So here's some examples of different kinds of things that organizations said during the research that the Common Approach was doing. And I'm sure you've heard or thought of things like that too. And in terms of the research that they were doing, they started to look around to see what was being done in other places. They began to gather research from a large variety of stakeholders and social purpose organizations, especially social enterprises. And it started in Ontario and then branched out to get a sense of what they needed to improve and scale up around impact measurement. And they were asking questions like, what does impact measurement look like around the world? Or how is it being carried out? What kind of data is being collected, and where is it being stored? How are the findings being used and communicated? What is common across all the different impact measurement approaches? Because the aim isn't to invent something new, but rather to see what has been shared, what's common across the majority of models and approaches, to find key elements that we can maybe all work from. And this is how they identified the common foundation for practitioners, while at the same time leaving the flexibility for details to be carried out as needed in different kinds of contexts. So it's not a rigid thing, it's something that is a commonality across different practitioners, where everybody can make decisions for the tools, for example, that they're using on their own. And here's an example that, there's so many different kinds of frameworks for impact evaluation right now in international development or environmental projects and health-related projects. But here's a few that they analyzed just to get a sense of how the common foundations cut across different kinds of models like this. And so this is now the common approach within which the common foundations piece is situated. And you can see the community ownership is that first enabling infrastructure. Because besides working with a really wide range of stakeholders and doing this international research, what was happening in the impact measurement community, there's also a governance body now that's being formed to identify protocols and processes that will sustain the common approach into the future, so that community-owned piece will be carried forward. It's not just an item, it is also linked through all of these other pieces. Looking at the second green box there with the data standard and the data platforms, there's been a lot of discussions with people, data researchers and data platforms, who have agreed to continue to integrate the data standard as they work. And that will make it possible to exchange information among platforms that are using the same data standard. And eventually it'll make it possible to roll up indicator information to tell a collective story without imposing specific metrics or specific measures. Basically, the data standard is not about the development of core metrics. Rather, it's making it possible for social purpose organizations to identify and enter indicators that they feel are meaningful, using their own specific phrasing and units of measurements, but then still allowing it for it to roll up with the other indicators from other social purpose organizations that share a similar idea. It's that concept of construct equivalence. And what it means is that we'll be able to tell a story of collective impact for indicators that share the same idea or goal. And I have to admit that this data piece, I read the documentation, but it's very detailed. And what I would suggest is, if you're interested in that piece, that you go to the website and read some of the documents that are available there. There's lots of really good information. The third one we'll get back to in a moment. And so I'll go to that blue one there, number 4. There's been an effort with the common approach to connect the data collection work to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. They've chosen a few specific indicators that they're working with to make those linkages between the SDGs and some of the work that might be going on in Canada, and also trying to reflect the Canadian commitment to the 2030 agenda. And the last piece there, number 5, there's been common work done to figure out what key organizational information is commonly needed by funders, so that organizations can gather that data once and use it for a variety of purposes. A lot of organizations were saying that they had to collect organizational information a number of different times for different organizations. And the hope is that this is a way to make that process a little bit less labor intensive, with a bit more standardization of the information that's requested about organizations. So those are that's the common approach, and I'm gonna keep going. If you're starting to write down your questions, if you have some, and put them in the chat box, or just write them down and ask them in a couple of minutes. I'm just gonna talk a little bit more about the common foundations. That's the common foundations is really the piece that we as practitioners, this is where we show up in the common approach. So these are the 5 common foundations, the 5 around the outside, those buttons. I'm going to start at the top, and the next slide I'll go into a little bit more detail, but I just want to give a quick overview of these. Starting at the top is plan your change. The next one is collect useful information. The one after that is gauge performance and impact. The next one is report on results. And the last one there is use performance measures. And you can see that they're not in a specific order. They're not a recipe. They're not steps. They're practices that are common across impact measurement, but they can be carried out in a number of different ways and possibly at different times or in a different order in any given project, depending on the situation. And in the middle there, you can see the people. It's important to recognize that the stakeholders are central to impact measurement. Stakeholder involvement is the 6th essential practice that permeates everything else, because you can't deeply understand or measure impact without engaging the people or the communities or the systems that are most affected. And so they really have to be part of identifying the needs or setting the vision for the hope for change or defining materiality, i.e. what matters, and collecting the relevant supported data. They really belong in every piece of the common foundations. Let's take a look at a little bit more detail. So here's the 5, and I'm gonna talk about this a little bit from the perspective of evaluators and consultants and trainers, so go into it a little bit more detail in that way. The first point there, planning your change, it's sort of planning and expressing your expected change. And you know, that may have very well have been based on a needs assessment that was done with your stakeholders when you were first starting the initiative. But it's important when you're doing impact projects because you have to think about the intended change at every step. During the project design, yes, also during evaluation design, and also, of course, during the evaluation activities. So that piece of intended change is really important. And that's, of course, as evaluators or as consultants or trainers, we're helping organizations to think about that. What's the change you hope to bring about in your with your program or with your project or your intervention? In what domains are you expecting to see the greatest change? Are you working at individual or group or community or systems change? Is it more immediate? Is it longer term? Is it a change that's going to affect other organizations? And it doesn't matter whether you're documenting that in a logic model or a theory of change or in an outcome map. The main thing is that everybody that's working on the project and in the evaluation starts to think about intended change and baseline data and how you're going to measure the difference between before the intervention and after the intervention. It gets you thinking about attribution and contribution. It even probably gets you thinking about whether you have enough resources to achieve the ends that you've set for yourself. So there's, and a lot of this, I guess, will sound very familiar to developmental evaluators. That piece of planning your change is really foundational to the common approach. The one underneath it there, the measuring tape, use performance measures. This is about using more than outputs to tell your story. Performance needs to be about outcomes and impacts, and that's going to change from context to context. It's the things that are described as better than, or an increase or decrease in, or improvements in. What is it that's actually changing? What indicators are most effective at illustrating the most valuable changes that can be linked to your intervention? Because you want to choose measures that are going to describe how you are moving the needle on something. And at the top of the second column there, collect useful information. And I'm sure most of you, if you're evaluators or also if you're organizations, you know, we often collect far too much data, or we collect data inconsistently, or we maybe don't collect the right data. Sometimes the data is needed for administrative purposes, but it isn't necessarily helping to make an impact argument. And, you know, we've all seen the kind of data collection where we know the ages and genders of our participants, but we can't necessarily link it to the impact argument that we're trying to make. So you need to be able to go back to that first button there. You need to be able to go back to your idea about how the intervention is going to bring about change, sort of that hypothesis of if we do X, then Y is going to happen, because then we'll know what information we most need to collect and from whom, and which stakeholders do we need to include, what balance of quantitative and qualitative metrics will be needed, and is there a way that we can make the impact argument with really lean data, like really just finding the most useful information in all of this. And I guess the term useful is somewhat subjective, and it's different in different situations, because it can be the most powerful information for an impact argument when it's held by sometimes a secondary stakeholder who has witnessed or experienced changes that are happening just outside the obvious line of vision. And as an example, I was working with a program that was helping newcomers navigate the medical system, and the program was saving cancer care thousands of dollars because appointments weren't being missed anymore, and appointments were going faster, and health outcomes were better because patients were getting the right information about their treatment. And that's really useful information when you're making an impact argument, but it might come from an interview with someone outside the program. So those kinds of things can influence what you're doing in impact measurement. The next one there, gauge performance and impact, is a point about, are you connecting the dots between your performance findings and the larger mission that you've set for yourself? Because the purpose of measuring performance is to describe the impact on a particular social or economic or environmental issue or political issue maybe. You're not just trying to see how far you can jump for your own sake. You want to know whether going farther will improve somebody's circumstances or capacity, or improve wider conditions, or how systems function. So this particular practice is about making a connection between performance and impact with the performance data that you've collected. And the last one is report on results. Are you reporting on results? Are you communicating your findings? Or is the data sitting in a database somewhere? We know that often we do surveys and we don't necessarily get around to reporting back to our stakeholders. And I guess to some degree, this is an ethical issue because we shouldn't be collecting and storing information that we're not using. But it's also a really important resource issue. If we're not going to report on our results within organizations or communities in a way that helps organizations learn and improve or scale up, then we're really not making the best use of our resources. And we all know that evaluation resources are scarce enough as it is. Effective reporting really increases learning and accountability. And certainly reporting is really important to funders. That's critical because they want to understand how their funds have been used. But it's also about communicating with the primary beneficiaries and getting the results validated. And hopefully, having heard all this, you may say that this all sounds like really good common sense, and that's great. That's the hope. But you can probably also think of situations where evaluation practices don't necessarily include these 5. They might include 1 or 2, but not the whole group together. And what's become clear through the Common Approaches research is that impact measurement really does need to reflect, at a minimum, these practices. And you know, sometimes there's evaluations that just do data collection, but it's not necessarily about change, or you know, data's collected that's not necessarily reported in the end. So really the ideal hope is that by having these kinds of 5 essential practices outlined, that it becomes possible to engage other stakeholders in the work and make sure that everybody's carrying out these elements. And then throughout that, I guess we'll be able to tell the story of impact so much better, because we'll be capturing outcomes and impacts that make these arguments rather than just looking at outputs. One more slide and then I'll open up for some questions. I just quickly wanted to mention that I mentioned before that these 5 foundational practices can be carried out in a number of different ways. And here's some of the examples of different techniques that this is entirely compatible with. There's many different tools and techniques that can be used, and the level of detail and complexity is going to vary from situation to situation. Sometimes you do need an SROI calculation with really carefully selected proxies, and other times maybe you're just getting going with some outcomes mapping, or some organizations are maybe doing evaluation work in-house, and sometimes they're bringing in external specialists for some of the work that might have their own methods that they're using. Or maybe you're just working on one piece for the moment, like developing a theory of change, and the other pieces will come down the road. So all of that is possible with this particular framework. And there's some of the resources that are listed here, they're worth following up on, but there's also a lot of resources that are available through the people that are doing impact measurement. I know some of the people that I spoke to already, they've developed resources like manuals and training materials, and I'm hoping that we have an opportunity to share some of those down the road. But there's also a website, Social Impact Tools. I think Kirsten may be able to put that into the link for that into the chat box. And it's also listed at the end. There's a lot of different tools that can inform an impact practice, an impact measurement practice. It occurs to me too, and when I start to talk about the benefits of the common foundations now, so not the broader common approach, which has its own benefits, but just in terms of for us as practitioners, I've been working with a number of clients that are smaller, that don't necessarily have evaluation expertise, and I've been doing impact measurement projects with them, but I feel like I now have a much simpler language that I can use to communicate with them about what impact measurement needs to contain. And so possibly there is also something around the common foundations, the working process, that could make it easier for small and medium organizations to understand what's involved. And I'm just going to move on here. I know there's a couple more questions, so we'll maybe tackle those at the end, but it's such a nice segue for this next piece around the benefits. One of the first things I'm going to say that sort of from a really practical standpoint, it seems to me that we can use the common foundations as a simple, plain language model to describe what differentiates impact measurement from other forms of data collection. By framing impact as something that's based on change and performance, we can see the difference, and I guess we can explain the difference to something like a standalone opinion poll, for example. And sometimes programs or projects are evaluated through standalone opinion polls. Did you like this? Did you like that? Do you feel that you learned a lot? It's not quite enough to actually make a full impact argument. And so I like that we have this way of saying that there are different ways of approaching evaluation. Impact evaluation is one of them. I think also that having a Canadian framework that is reflective of both local, meaning all of us that work at the grassroots, because of the ownership, the community ownership piece, it's a framework that reflects local and international work, but it also contains the interests of all these different kinds of stakeholders who are concerned about impact evaluation and impact measurement. So I think that is a real benefit. And having a plain language model that communicates what the minimum or the essential practices are of impact measurement. There's so much development going on right now around the world. There's tools and products that are being developed, it seems like almost every week. And it's easy to lose sight of what it is fundamentally that we're trying to do with evaluation. So this to me kind of summarizes it all. It summarizes the bare essentials without taking away the ability to work the way that I need to, for example, in a certain context, because I'm going to choose tools and methods and approaches and timeframes based on, in my case, it's my client, or if you're a consultant, then you can make decisions based on the broader mission of what the organization is, what they're trying to do. And absolutely, things are going to get much more complex as we figure out the hows and whys of a given evaluation or measurement exercise, but we can communicate about the big picture in a really accessible way. And the other person doesn't have to be an evaluation specialist. And I think it also points out where the organization's responsibility might lie for strong impact measurements, because often, I'm sure those of you that are consultants or trainers or evaluators out there, coming in at the end of a project is notoriously difficult, because at that point it's hard to make the impact argument the way it needs to be made. So there's a way of saying, well, we have to actually do a little bit of thinking about all of these 5 components. So basically, a strong value description comes from having the right evidence to fully demonstrate that important changes have occurred through the eyes and the lived experience of various stakeholders. And that somehow, to me, seems to be captured in these 5, in the common foundations. There's also, of course, the fact of being able to, us as practitioners, if we can demonstrate alignment with the common foundations when that's appropriate, and kind of lean on that collective credibility of what's going on nationally and internationally. That kind of alignment can have benefits from a quality or a competitive perspective. Working with a well-researched and well-developed model lends credibility to the work of impact measurement overall. And it makes it easier both to find other professionals who work in this way, and to find organizational partners that understand what's involved in impact measurement. And that, building that community of practice is, of course, also a benefit, because you hear diverse views, you find out about new tools and techniques, you hear about other people's challenges, you can begin to develop impact measurement themes for conferences, for example, if there's enough people. And I know I spoke with a few people leading up to this webinar. There's quite a few people that feel that they're working a little bit in isolation, and they would really like to connect with colleagues doing impact measurement across the country. So, and I guess also in terms of setting professional development goals, having a framework like this, the Common Foundations, helps us think through where we might want to develop our own skills and experience. It's that self-reflective piece when you see that if these are the tasks that we'll need to carry out in a range of settings, then what do we need to learn? What processes, tools, or products do we need to have at the ready? Or if we're transitioning an organization from other kinds of data collection to impact measurement, here's some of the skills that might need to be developed, or the capacities to be developed in-house. And all of that really helps to grow the impact measurement field, which will benefit all of us, evaluators, consultants, trainers, social purpose organizations, funders, researchers, policymakers, into the future. I think it'll be very helpful for us to be able to have a collective picture of the really important work that's going on in the social purpose sector. And this idea of alignment now, getting to that and getting to the question about the champions as well. An idea of alignment, it's not formal recognition, it's not accreditation. There's no product that's being sold. It's much more open than that. It's open because the Common Approach research has indicated that it's better to start with more open processes, and then to let the community determine over time, through experience and theory and thinking about things, how the minimum standards are best nurtured or expanded. And that really reflects the community-owned principle. So if the Common Foundation seems intriguing to you and you're curious about using them or aligning more publicly with them, I would invite you to learn more by going to some of the websites. A couple of slides from now, I'm going to have a list with all the different links to it that we can send out afterwards. There's videos to watch, there's other webinars to participate in. The webinars are also listed on the Common Approach website, and they're all really useful and interesting. If you're not sure about alignment, you can do a self-assessment that we've developed. So you can see which areas you're most aligned in and maybe see which things you'd like to learn more about. And you can see there that I've put a date of March 20th. That's related to the champion piece, if you're interested in being a champion as well, which is a little bit more. There's also some very interesting training that's been developed by the Social Value Lab and the Social Enterprise Institute. So we've listed that information on the CCEDNet website as well as the resource slides. And there's different formats for that training, so you can choose what might work best in your workplace. And we also, you can see at the bottom it says join the LinkedIn group, but there's actually 2 LinkedIn groups. One of them is for the Common Approach more generally, you can find that. And then we've just created the one for the Common Foundations, which will be more for practitioners doing the evaluation and consulting and training work. We're going to keep a drip feed of information going on that one, and gradually include possibly articles that people have read that they really enjoyed, or books or tools that have been very helpful. And hopefully in a few months we can connect on Zoom maybe and bring some of the people together that are doing this kind of work. And so this is sort of a general building of community of practice. And then this is the next slide. If you're really intrigued with this and this really appeals to you, and let's say you've done the self-assessment and you know that your work aligns really well with the 5 practices, then you also have the opportunity that you can use the icons and logos in your own work. We're creating a package with the PowerPoint slide and with some handouts and with some descriptions of different ways that you can use the Common Foundations. And we'll be ready to send that out, I think, in about 2 weeks. And so you can use that within your organization or with clients. And going back, I guess, to the question, the earlier question about whether champions would be involved in the promotion of those different points or be able to use those, yes, that's absolutely a piece of it. If you feel that that's something that would help your clients or help other colleagues to learn what impact measurement is about, then we welcome the use of those icons and logos for champions in particular. And with the champions, what we're going to do is we're going to be profiling some of the champions every once in a while, just to be able to show the different ways and contexts in which impact measurement is being carried out. Actually, one person even suggested a book club, so maybe there's other ideas that will spring from this once the champions and the broader group of people using the logos and icons gets going. The information will be posted on LinkedIn and on the Common Foundations webpage that CCEDNet has started. We just recently had a really great first interview with Laurie Ringard from Change Weavers Consulting here in Winnipeg. So watch for that in mid-April. She'll be the first person that we profile a little bit more fully. And then we also have some really interesting impact consultants from BC and Ontario and from the East Coast on board. So we'll be, over the course of the next year, we'll be sending out more information through the website and the LinkedIn page. And of course, if you'd like to be a champion, if really championing this is something that you're interested in, just a reminder, if you can complete the self-assessment, the link will be, I'll show you that in a second, by March 20th, that would be great, and include your contact information so we can find you. We're gonna try and get back to everybody quite quickly, but really do request your patience because of the numbers of people who have been interested. We're thrilled with the engagement and the willingness to talk more about impact measurement, but we might need a little bit of time to get back to you. And really more concretely in terms of the champions, what it means is that you would have completed a self-assessment and you consider yourself well aligned. And in terms of what that means, you'll see when you go through the questions that you have a choice of saying, I do these different tasks constantly or frequently or occasionally or rarely or never. And the hope is that you would consider yourself well aligned if most of your answers are sort of on that constantly, frequently side, and maybe a few occasionals, knowing that there's certain very specialized things like, for example, SROI calculations that might be more rare. You might not do them as often, but you may still be aware of how they function. The main thing is that if you're answering rarely or never to some of the impact measurement tasks that are really central, now that you know what those are, then there might be a little bit of professional development that needs to happen first. So if you've thought about, that, and then you think about where you might want to use the logos and icons. For example, I taught a workshop before Christmas about theory of change, and I just plugged in one slide where I explained that here was one framework to talk about impact measurement and to show how theory of change might fit into a much bigger process. So it can be something as simple as that. You can contact Kirsten and I and let us know if you feel that you're well aligned and you have some ideas for how you might want to use the logos and icons, and you'd need to be willing to follow the style guide and the branding guidelines for the logo and icons. And then we'd love to see at some point an example of the kind of thing that you've incorporated the logo and the icon into. So those would be the kinds of things that champions would do that's maybe a little bit more than people who are just using the logos and icons without communicating quite as much with us and being an active part of the community of practice. But we really do hope that you will be willing to stay in touch over the next year so we can hear how different people are thinking about the Common Foundations. The Common Approach team and CCEDNet really want to encourage as many people and organizations as possible to recognize that they're aligned with the Common Foundations and to promote them as a minimum standard of impact measurement. And I think there's all sorts of other kinds of opportunities that will grow for learning and sharing resources and taking this to the next level as we move forward. I'm just going to go through these pretty quickly so that you can see what they are, and then we'll take some more questions. So here's the first batch of resources, and another group of resources. You can see that there's videos and training modules there. And here's our emails. We'll make sure that that's available to you as well through an email. If you miss, don't catch it from here. There's other ways to catch it from the different websites. And finally, here's an example of all the different partners that are working on the project. And there's more, but these are some of them. And then just want to thank you and open the floor to more questions.
Okay. And right now, we have one question again from the Shift Collaborative. Some of what you shared, Margerit, helped answer some of their questions, but they wonder if there are specific benefits for their own learning, such as will there be a community of practice for the champions, and will champions get access to things like the results and the tools?
Thanks, great question. Yes, I think that what's going to end up happening, not just the champions that are actually profiled, like the smaller number of people that we profile through CCEDNet in order to get the much larger conversation going. But my hope is absolutely that we start to have regular Zoom meetings, for example, where we can bring people together and we can talk about the kinds of things that we need to learn. And I was amazed already with the people that I spoke with, the amount of the wealth of experience and knowledge and the different kinds of approaches that are being used within this broader category of impact measurement that we can learn so much from. And I feel like I developed a small community of practice. I actually called us the Impactivists, but a small community of practice locally here. And then after an ECHONU conference, where a few of us were talking about evaluation and impact measurement, we ended up having a group of people that met over the course of 2 years, about once every 2 months or so, to have a conversation and workshop each other's projects, or if we hit a challenge, then we were able to talk to other practitioners that had a similar approach. We even had some people over from England that were participating. So I think there's opportunities for a broader community of practice. Part of it is that we're probably all very busy too, but I know that for this year, I'm going to be involved in this project, and I'm working with people working with the Common Foundations, and in particular with the champions. So we will be finding opportunities to bring them together and then to keep feeding that learning out into the broader community, so that maybe there is at some point an opportunity, even at, for example, American Evaluation Conference in Portland in the fall, or the Canadian Evaluation Society conference coming up, that we start to have groups that can meet and talk about the kinds of issues we're experiencing with impact measurement. I welcome suggestions.
There's a request from Alan Art Ed to speak. So if she wants to unmute herself and make a comment.
Hi, my name is Christy, and I know Marguerite well because we met through both participating in a social impact for social learning group at McGill. Gosh, what was that, Marguerite? I think my little guy was a baby, so it was probably 6 years ago. And so Marguerite invited me into this conversation, and I came in a little not knowing what this was, but that I trust Marguerite and that it was probably going to be a really good idea. And what I see is that something I need as a professional, which is that since we did that group, I haven't really been part of a learning community of practice in what for me is like living and breathing, is to be thoughtful about socioeconomic impact of the work that I do at all times. But, you know, as I say that, I'm involved in managing a program right now where I've, you know, not yet built a framework for its evaluation because I've been so busy in the doing. So what I like about the idea of having a chance to be part of a Canadian network of learning is that it will bring me back and provide me with people, ideally in a practice environment, to bounce ideas off of and keep me on my toes around the frameworks and lenses and practices I could be using. So I embrace the fact that you've created this opportunity. Thank you very much. And I'll follow and see how I fit in. But I think having practitioners who care deeply across the country about really being mindful and able to measure impact. It's not self-evident. You know, I know we want things to come from the community up, and I am very deeply, you know, invested in that as someone who, you know, is on the board of a community organization and does all kinds of things in trying to make sure that the person on the ground is the one informing my work. But in the measurement of the difference we make, there is a level of work required that isn't self-evident to everyone running an organization, because they're too busy, just as I became too busy. They're too busy doing the doing to take that step back and say, how do I measure my doing really well? So anyway, all to say, I'm delighted with the idea that this exists and happy to follow.
Thank you, Christy. Nice to see you. Yeah.
Okay, and we have one more question, and we have about time for just one more question. There's a question that someone works for an SBO that has a fairly tentative approach to impact evaluation, and while the common approach makes a lot of sense to them, this person would like to see their organization incorporate them more widely and get buy-in from leadership, but unsure where to start. So they recognize it's a broad question, but what is the best way to get started, especially around data collection and management?
Right, great question, because I think with in my case, I'm working independently with different clients. So every time I go to a client, I have to start where they're at. And it could be any of those 5 common foundations where really the conversation starts. And then inevitably, I try to bring them back to the concept of theory of change or logic model, a way for them to think about the ways that they're hoping to have an impact and where the different metrics would be found for that argument. So I build out from there, but I think it really depends on your organization and what the key driver is for your organization. So if you like, you can send me an email and maybe we can have a bit more of a back and forth about that. I could give you a little bit of advice maybe, but it really depends on each situation, where you start small, and as people start to learn and understand what this is all about and what impact is and what social impact is as compared to economic impact, and the fact that cost benefit analysis is something a little bit different, once that learning grows, then you start to be able to implement more sophisticated, I guess, impact measurement processes, but also the pieces of the puzzle are linked more closely together. And so you end up getting better results. So a little bit of a vague answer, but I don't know enough about the specific situation. Yeah. All right, so I think we're at the hour. Thank you so much, everybody. Again, we were thrilled with the huge amount of response to this webinar, and we will be doing other ones in the future. There'll be one in French coming up late April or early May, and then we'll have some other ones in the months that follow. And I'm going to be casting out emails every once in a while, asking if people have questions or want to get involved in different things. So you can expect to hear from me again too. Thanks very much.